All right, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our second panel of today's conference. This one on one of the most distinctive aspects of the Communist Party in the United States, the strong reactions against it. This panel will focus on anti-communism and the Red Scares. Our first speaker is Laurie Clune, UC Davis, correct?
UC Davis PhD, but I'm at Cal State.
Ah, excuse me. She'll be speaking on the Rosenbergs.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I would love to thank the organizers for allowing a non-Communist Party historian in the room. Really appreciate that. I feel very much fish out of water. I appreciate your graciousness as I bring a slightly different perspective. My connection to the Communist Party, well, certainly in my scholarship, is because I focus on the Rosenbergs. But I'm really a diplomatic historian, so this feels a little uncomfortable. But for street cred, my maternal grandfather was a communist, if that helps. So I'm allowed to say. Yeah, he was a communist in New York City. He was a shoe worker union organizer and probably the guy that most inspired me to be a historian in the first place. So in some ways, I guess I can be here, but I appreciate your patience with me as I'm learning so much, and I really appreciate this opportunity and to be on a panel with these amazing people. It's quite awesome. Thank you. So some of this stuff you know, and I don't mean to reiterate, but we'll make sure we're all on the same page. FBI agents arrested Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in New York City in the summer of 1950, accused of conspiracy to commit espionage. The couple was convicted and sentenced to death in the spring of 1951. Appeals delayed their executions until June of 1953. So the time between 1951 and 1953 allowed for a protest movement to evolve. It began with a few individuals in New York City, and it spread to 84 cities in nearly 50 countries around the world. So using newly discovered State Department documents, I've traced the Truman and Eisenhower administrations' attempts to counter those global protest movements against the death sentence for the Rosenbergs. Here I'm trying, and I stress the word trying because sometimes you feel like you're trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. I don't know if you have this feeling with it. I'm trying to explore the connections between the American Communist Party, the National Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case, and the larger global protest movement, which everyone said, well, that sounds great, you should totally do that. And now I know why they told me to do it, because maybe it's not possible, I don't know. So I'm trying to pull some threads together here. But so today I'm going to look specifically at a handful of European countries, and Canada, the United States, and Australia, very quickly. And the pivotal decisions made by communist parties and Rosenberg protesters, basically focusing on the fall of 1952, which is when stuff starts to get a little crazy. I am very openly building on the terrific work of many historians, including Philip Deary in Australia, who has done more work on Australian protests for the Rosenbergs than anyone I know. And I'm trying to argue that US officials, whether in the United States or diplomats overseas, often misunderstood what I seem to be finding is a very complicated relationship between Communist Party leadership and committees organized to try to save the couple. In some cases you can tease out the connection and sometimes you can't, and that's what I'm still grappling with. So for the committee itself, the National Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case, which one of my students said was the worst title of any organization. They were like, what were they thinking? I'm like, you mean the NCSJRC? So we'll just call it the committee because, goodness. But so a leftist non-communist journalist brought attention to the plight of the Rosenbergs with a series of articles that began in August of 1951 in the National Guardian, which was leftist but apparently independent of the Communist Party. In October of 1951, that guy, William Rubin, joined with David Allman, who had left the party, I believe, in 1939, and Emily Allman, who had never been an active Communist Party member per se, and another gentleman, Joseph Brainin, who was not a communist, apparently, to create this committee that we're just going to call the committee. Okay. So Philip Deary has described the committee as, quote, organic, anti-top-down Stalinist control. And most historians agree that it's unlikely that the committee was a front for the Communist Party, though that relationship is complicated. But generally, as I will show it, they weren't so jazzed about this committee until about November of '52. However, of course, many US government officials assumed that it was communist affiliated, whether the Attorney General, who labeled it a communist organization, or the FBI, their Psychological Strategy Board, or HUAC, they all connected it to the Communist Party. So in January of 1952, the committee reached out to progressive organizations around the world, urging them to write letters from overseas and form Save the Rosenberg committees. By the way, a better title than the committee that, like, why didn't you guys just call yourselves that? Learn from us, I don't know, is their thing. And they basically said, you know, create a committee and try to save the Rosenbergs, and good luck, we can only help you with inspiration. We have no money. There was no, quote, Moscow gold, you're on your own. So they tried to do this. The Daily Worker reported that there was an emerging global protest movement in countries like Scotland, Ireland, England, France, Mexico, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That was in August of '52, which is a little early, and I'll explain why when I get here about the Communist Party itself. So, as you all know, when the Supreme Court upheld the Smith Act convictions in Dennis versus U.S. in 1950, 11 of America's top communists went to prison for up to 5 years. And for my purposes, there are two results of that. One is this meant a virtual decapitation of the CPUSA, leaving the party scrambling. The party really was not in a position to mount a very effective propaganda campaign since they were trying to deal with the fact that they had lost so many of their leaders. Right? The second part of that is that the 5 Communist Party defense attorneys in the Dennis case were charged with contempt of court and faced up to 6 months in prison. And that, of course, sent a chill through the progressive legal community, making it difficult for Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to secure high-quality counsel. Anyone who looks at the case pretty much gets frustrated with Manny Block and how he handled the case, and see some mistakes there. So that could have been some of the impact of this. So the remaining, and I would bow to you guys to say, Communist Party leadership, I don't know if we put that in quotes, or they, guy still in the room, initially tried with whatever power they had to limit the committee's activities, mostly because they were still afraid that Julius was going to break down and name other Soviet agents, and that would implicate the Communist Party, so wanting to distance. So sometimes it seemed like CPUSA, and again, leadership, I guess in quotes, ignored the committee. Sometimes they tried to undermine the work of the committee, but generally they believed that the party would not look good if it was defending convicted spies. Okay. There's some indication that perhaps the Soviets were trying to get these communist parties around the world to plant pro-Rosenberg propaganda, if you will, in communist papers around the world. Whether that was definitely adhered to it's hard to tease that out to see. It seems, specifically when we're looking at the United States and Australia, that, and we'll start with the United States, so the CPUSA began to openly support the committee to take away from accusations of anti-Semitism surrounding the Slansky trial. So the Slansky trial was the show trial in November 1952, led to executions in December of '52, the hangings of several, 9 to 11 folks who were charged with Zionist Trotskyist plots, treason, and sabotage. And 8 of the 11 who were killed were Jewish. So CIA agents started to track that Soviets were, since they were being accused of anti-Semitism because of the Slansky trial and the hangings connected to that, they said, okay, now the communists and the Soviets are openly supporting the Rosenbergs to stave off that charge of anti-Semitism. Like, we can't be anti-Semitic, we're supporting the Rosenbergs, who are Jewish. So they, the CIA agents reported that they saw that communists were endorsing these Save the Rosenberg campaigns to counter the negative publicity of the Slansky trial, in the United States predominantly. Okay, also, Communist Party leadership chose to work with the committee, the thought is, by November of '52, because Julius didn't confess. And they felt at that point it was unlikely that he would. Also, there's some indication that perhaps the Communist Party decided to support the committee because the rank and file were largely supportive of the Rosenbergs. And so there's a bit of pressure that way. Years later, a high-ranking CPA official, CPUSA official, recalled this shift in policy, saying, quote, "They're heroes, they're going to their death and not saying a word," end quote. So wanting the CPUSA supporting them. So when the committee in the United States reached out to those progressive organizations around the world in 1952 and said, you guys should create your own Save the Rosenberg committees, many countries responded. And it seems in those cases, the Communist Party leaderships in those countries were supportive much earlier. For example, in Australia, Save the Rosenberg committees were organized in January of 1952, branches opening in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. And I should say, and I think I complicated, so let me back up a second. So the United States and Australia, you can tell I'm still working through this stuff. I don't know how you guys do this, I'm very impressed. United States and Australia seem to be the countries that said, the Communist Party said, no, not yet. Other places, as we'll see, embraced the committees much earlier. So CP Australia did not join and only openly supported the committee after November of 1952 for similar reasons given by the CPUSA. However, U.S. Embassy officials understood that the Communist Party was likely involved because they had spies working with the Australian communists. So, okay, and then I love this. Now it gets complicated. I'm confused already, but normally my papers are not like this. It's sort of, so recap, if we've got the United States and Australia saying, okay, Communist Party leadership, no, we're not going to support the Rosenbergs until the Slansky trial, and then they're like, okay, now we better do it. Okay, but then when you look at other communist parties around the world and these other protests, you see support before the Slansky trial, which is the part I'm trying to figure out. And I'm looking at, because I don't speak 12 languages, because I barely speak English, so I'm dealing with problematic sources. As we know, State Department sources are problematic because the embassy officials are kind of writing what they see through their lens, which is very distinct. But we know from these State Department documents that as early as like early October, the Communist Party in France is openly supporting the Rosenbergs in organizing Save the Rosenberg committees and articles in communist newspapers, and that's the embassy reports this is going to spread throughout Europe, and they were right. The Swiss Communist Party embraces, again, early October, Communist Party in Rome. What makes the State Department documents so fun is their vernacular. So they're like in Rome in October 21st, 1952. They say, this is the first of what we are sure many commie protests to come, which is great. We've got, Switzerland, France, Rome, the Netherlands, and these are not just the Communist Party leadership, these are Communist Party newspapers and growing Save the Rosenberg committees. Again, pre-Slansky, which is opposite what the standard belief was. And most of these are, as the embassy officials state, they're getting the commie protest machinery in action, right? And they're putting all their efforts behind this. And the State Department, of course, assumes this is Soviet-directed, which is unclear yet, I guess. I'm still grappling with that. I mean, it could be, but we're not sure. So most of these articles are questioning whether they were guilty at all, questioning the American judicial system, emphasizing, of course, as they often do, the plight of the two young sons who would be orphaned when the parents are killed, and issuing a call to action, sometimes saying we have to prevent another Sacco and Vanzetti, kind of using that as problematic short language there. So I'm trying to put this in a global context to see why they embrace when they do. Like what's causing it in October if we thought it was not because until the Slansky trial in November, December. Okay. Wrapping up here, let's see. So with the open embrace of communist parties around the world, US officials and diplomats doubled down on believing that it was all Communist Party directed. And they didn't acknowledge that there was a possibility that some of this might have been grassroots, particularly Save Ethel and the mother of two children. That part seemed to bring in some grassroots folks that might not have been connected to the Communist Party. And as the protests go along, they really do expand beyond the Communist Party to leftists and then to openly anti-communists, and it kind of grows, as we'll see. One example of this is when several dozen protesters brought a petition asking for clemency for the Rosenbergs to the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. The embassy officials concluded, quote, half were women, some of whom appeared to be motherly types who had been enlisted as fronts. As if they couldn't imagine that a mom might be like, oh, don't kill that mom. She must have been hired as a front because she's a guy. It just seemed like a lack of imagination, but anyway. So according to these diplomats, it didn't seem possible that non-communist mothers in sympathy for a mother on death row might actually join this protest movement. In November of 1952, US government officials assumed that motherly types were fronts, and they would continue to assume this through the executions in June of 1953. So just to try to wrap this up in some way that makes sense, we know that from December 52 through January of 53, foreign press protest spreads beyond the communist papers to socialist papers, to even liberal anti-communist papers throughout Canada, Europe, Australia. The Save the Rosenberg campaign really gets a jolt of energy in January 7th, 1953, when Pope Pius XII publicly condemns the scheduled executions. That opens the floodgates to global Catholic and anti-death penalty protesters and non-communist protesters, particularly throughout Latin America, and that really expands the protest movement. The protesters try to pressure the newly inaugurated president, Eisenhower, in mid-January of 1953, and Eisenhower is not particularly moved by that. So by exploring the protest movements of the United States, Canada, Australia, and a handful of European countries in the fall of 1952, I think we see a complex story of the role of the communist parties in these countries and these demonstrations. While the CPUSA and the CP Australia, those communist parties initially discouraged Rosenberg case protesters, others appear to have embraced these activists. Some progressive activists, some rank-and-file communists. I think it kind of hit across the boards there. I'd like to try, and I will, over the next few minutes, try to tease out the relationship between these protesters, especially the grassroots, committee protesters, their connection to Communist Party leadership and the CPUSA. Try to fill that out. While the assumption by American diplomats serving overseas was that all protests were Communist Party directed, this just seems too simplistic, but it remains unclear. The role of the communist parties, the CPUSA in particular, in the protests to save Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And those protests would, of course, continue and spread to nearly 50 countries by the time of their deaths in June of 1953. So I welcome any comments when we get to that point if you have any advice. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Denise Lynn from the Southern Indiana University in Evansville. We share a connection to the state. We also share a connection to the notorious figure George Mink, who will figure in her paper.
All right. Okay, so by 1934, Herbert Solow was getting tired of his friend Whittaker Chambers' politics. Chambers was a committed communist and a member of the American Communist Party. Solow was an anti-Stalinist and vocal critic of the party in the Soviet Union. The two had regular arguments that eventually devolved into name-calling. Solow frequently called Chambers a Stalinist, which he did not appreciate. It all came to a head in a hospital in 1934. Visiting their mutual friend Adelaide Walker after the birth of her child, Solow and Chambers did what they always did. They started discussing politics and exchanged hot words. After they left the room to give the new mother some peace from their constant bickering, the argument intensified outside. The argument became so heated that Solow called Chambers a revolting cynic and told him he wanted nothing to do with him. The old college friends parted ways and would not see each other again until 1938. And that's a much older picture of Herbert Solow. That's not him in 34. All right, when Solow and Chambers rekindled their friendship, Chambers was desperate to separate himself from the Communist Party as the Soviet purges and show trials put those in the underground in danger. Then in December 1937, a series of events brought the purges to Chambers and Solow and would draw the friends back together and away from the left towards anti-communism. In early December, an American married couple went missing in Moscow. On December 2nd, Donald Robinson went missing after allegedly being taken to the hospital for pneumonia. His frantic wife was taken on December 10 and would reappear days later in Lublanka prison. On December 17th, the seventh-month-long disappearance of American communist Juliet Stewart Points was reported in the New York World Telegram, and that's Juliet Stewart Points right there. It was Points' disappearance that pushed Chambers to finally leave the underground, and it was the Robinsons' and Points' cases that would bring the two friends together again. These incidents would push both men toward abandoning their previous political affiliations and move towards anti-communism. Though Solow was only ever a background figure in American anti-communism, Whittaker Chambers would gain both fame and notoriety as an ex-communist witness. Both were influential in framing anti-communist discourses, and essential to that was Juliet Stewart Points' disappearance. Solow's investigation into her disappearance and Chambers' knowledge of the underground uncovered the terror people faced if they ran afoul of Stalin, and confirmed for them that Stalin was merely a symptom and communism was the disease. For both men, her disappearance pushed them toward rejecting both the party and Marxism and embracing anti-communism. Their work in the Cold War, via newspaper articles, public testimony, and Chambers' book Witness, guaranteed that Points' disappearance became a foundational story in American anti-communism, even if her name was never known to the average American. Chambers and Solow met at Columbia College, where they were friendly with one another and moved in the same circles. After the college, the two saw little of each other. Chambers would join the Communist Party in 1925, and around the same time, Solow was exploring communism, and it was his interest in that subject that brought them back together. Solow and Chambers would frequently get together to talk about politics in a friendly manner. In the summer of 1932, Solow traveled to the Soviet Union and then to Turkey to visit the exiled Leon Trotsky. He claimed he was appalled at the conditions in the Soviet Union. After his meeting with Trotsky, he came back to the United States and began to steer American leftists away from the party and towards Trotskyism, though Solow himself remained independent of formal organizations. Around this time, Chambers informed Solow that he was no longer a member of the American Communist Party and was now in the Russian Party. Chambers' growing involvement with the Communist Party began to strain the friendship. Eventually, Solow became fed up with Chambers' quote, smug devotion to the Moscow regime. And by the fall of 1934, they saw less of each other. Solow was becoming disgusted with Stalinists, and each time he met with Chambers, they would end up arguing about politics. By the visit with their friend Walker in the hospital, the two were ready to part ways. Communism drove them apart, but anti-communism would bring the friends back together. The summer and fall of 1937 proved to be enormously consequential for both Solow and Chambers. Michael Kimmage argues that Chambers' turn to the right happened gradually around this time as he learned about individuals who were purged. By his own admission, he began to break from communism in 1937. Still in the underground, he was being ordered to Moscow, which many saw as a death sentence. Then he learned about the attempted defection and murder of Ignace Reiss, a Soviet spy working in Paris, which moved him deeply. But it was Points' murder that, quote unquote, touched him closely and sickened him in a physical way. He decided to learn from Reiss's and Points' mistakes and try to get he and his family out of the Soviets' clutches. That fall of 1937, Solow learned through their old college friend Meyer Shapiro that Chambers was getting fed up with Stalinism. Solow went to speak to Shapiro, who offered up no additional information on Chambers and refused to even approach the topic. Then the Robinson case made headlines in December, and shortly after that, Points' disappearance. By the end of December 1937, authorities learned that Mr. and Mrs. Donald Robinson were in fact Arnold and Ruth Rubens, and both had suspected ties to the Communist Party. This linked the case to Points', and some came to believe that there must have been a direct connection between them. The Communist Party, meanwhile, disavowed Points, claiming she left the party in 1934. It also claimed that the Robinson-Rubens were Trotskyite agents trying to spy on the Soviets. Let's see if I can get this to work. So this is the fraudulent passport pictures that they traveled to the Soviet Union on. These are the Robinsons. These are Ruth Rubens and Arnold Rubens, A.A. Rubens. Solow suspected that the cases were linked and was collecting information on Points' disappearance, working with Carlo Tresca and other contacts he still had in the party. He was having a harder time proving that Points had any connection to the Robinson-Rubens, except that they were all known communists and had allegedly fallen afoul of Soviet authorities. He was eager to get in touch with his old friend Chambers, but as it turned out, Chambers would be coming to him. On a snowy night in February 1938, after some of Solow's articles on the Robinson-Rubens and Points appeared in the New York Sun, and Carlo Tresca's accusations against the party were making headlines, two men appeared outside Solow's front door. Their faces hidden behind collars and hats. Solow recognized them. It was Chambers and Mike Intrater, a mutual friend who was forced out of the party during the Lovestoneite controversy in 1929. Solow refused to let the men come into his home, but he did agree to leave with them. Putting on his overcoat, he remembered a movie he had recently seen in which someone put a pipe in their pocket to mimic a gun. Solow grabbed his pipe, thrust it into his pocket, and walked out his front door with a gun pointed at the men. With it, he forced them down the street to a nearby restaurant. Once inside, Solow looked Chambers dead in the eye and asked, "Do you have anything to do with the liquidation of Points?" Chambers said he did not, but also did not take issue with Solow describing her as liquidated. Solow thought this was remarkable, and perhaps he must have known something. At the very least, this meant that Chambers had heard her screams in his imagination. The two men revisited this moment several times in their writing and testimony, and though the details would vary, including the pipe gun, one thing that remained the same was the role Points played in both their reunification and their move away from Marxism. Both men used gendered language to describe this moment. They each described Points as a victim of the Soviets, a construction of the pre-Cold War years. After the Cold War, female spies were coded as gender traitors. But before the Cold War, when Stalin was the enemy and not communism itself, it was still possible to forgive former communist spies. Forgotten in their accounts was that Points, a leading party figure and underground agent for several years, was part of the very communist apparatus that both would come to resist. She becomes, in their view, a victim, a perpetual adolescent who is not responsible for her own actions, though at the time of her disappearance, she was 50 years old. In Chambers' memoirs, he wrote that he knew of Points as a party leader, but never knew she was in the underground until her disappearance. He described her as an intensely feminine woman, who was heavy-set and dark, but also softly feminine. This repetition of her femininity created a sympathetic image, though by all accounts, Points was a forceful and sometimes abrasive personality. Chambers described her disillusionment as a physical affliction. She began to sag self-consciously from the weight of secret authority and knowledge. He suggested that it was Points' inability to handle authority and knowledge, a specifically gendered affliction, that would lead to her liquidation. He also claimed that while he was leaving the party, he could see her in his mind's eye. While Reiss's murder affected him, it was the disappearance of Points that would affect him both emotionally and physically. Solo used similarly gendered language when describing Points. He repeatedly suggested it was Points' screams that influenced Chambers to finally leave the underground, and it was her screams that led Chambers back to Solo. Solo never described Points as an active participant in the Soviet underground. Rather, she became a victim. These gender codes made her disappearance and arrest all the more troubling. That the party could so callously dispatch one of its valued leaders, a helpless woman, was a strong motivator for Chambers to make his break. After their first meeting, Solo claimed it was some months until Chambers was in touch again. So Solo was writing about the Robinsons case and Points in the New York Sun and New Leader, and decided he would try to contact Chambers by writing under pseudonyms that might catch Chambers' attention. Publishing under both W.C. Hambers or Walter Hambers, and you can see the W.C. Hambers right there. Solo tried to reach out to Chambers to find out what he knew about Points and the Robinson-Rubens. That same month, Chambers made his final break by moving his family out of their current residence and moving into another. He wanted to speak to an authority and share whatever information he had about the underground, partly to locate enemies of the state, but primarily to protect himself and his family. Chambers, aware of Solo's articles on the spy cases, found Solo again in hopes that he could connect Chambers to federal authorities. At this next meeting, Solo instructed him to make a complete and detailed history of his time in the party, and then to let party leaders know of such a document so that they knew if he was killed, the information would be leaked. By this point, Solo had done a lot of legwork on the Points case. Still unclear if there was any connection between her disappearance and the Robinsons-Rubens case. Solo interviewed several of Points' friends. He basically found out what she was doing in the days before her disappearance. Through these friends, he discovered some of what Points had done in the underground. Solo located a man named Mark Ribard, a former underground agent who had been recruited by Points. He learned that Points' job in the underground was to recruit international students from Columbia College to return to their home countries and work as underground couriers. Ribard first met Points in 1935. She was using her married name, Juliet Glaser. In 1913, Points married a German national named Frederick Franz Ludwig Glaser, which meant, as a woman marrying a German national, she lost her American citizenship. Their relationship was quite rocky, and the two only lived together for a short time. They finally broke off contact in 1924, though they never officially divorced, and Points was forced to apply for naturalization. By then, she was deeply involved in communist politics, and some suggest she was being actively recruited for underground work. Points used the sexist law that left her stateless and applied for citizenship twice, with two different spellings of her last name. No doubt this was intentional, and Points was always inconsistent with spellings of her name, which gave her several pseudonyms to work with in the underground. Solo also learned from Ribard that Points tried to recruit journalist William Harlan Hale. Both Hale and Ribard told Solo about a woman they believed was Points' handler. She went by several names, including Lena and Miss West. Lena would be one of the more mysterious characters in the Points disappearance, confirmed later by Chambers to be a dangerous and unpredictable underground agent who did not get along with Points and may in fact have been Points' undoing. Lena lived in the American Women's Association clubhouse where Points also lived. Solo speculated that this was so she could keep an eye on Points. Solo knew most of this information by the time he and Chambers reconnected, but he was still not clear what, if any, connection there was between Points and Robinsons-Rubens, and what role the other cast of characters had in Points' disappearance, including Lena, or Tina, or Miss West. In the fall of 1938, he met with Chambers on 3 different occasions, and Chambers offered some new information that provided a tenuous link between the missing spies and confirmed that Points was likely liquidated by the Soviets. Chambers told Solo that A.A. Rubens was in fact a Let named Ewald, later confirmed by Walter Kravitsky, and that Rubens was an underground operative whose job it was to produce fake passports. Chambers also knew the woman Lena, known to him as Tina, that Points worked with and believed it was the same woman. She had a missing, part of her index finger was missing, that's why we know it was the same woman. Anyway, she's got a lot of names. All right, so he confirmed that Lena was dangerous and well-connected in the underground. Following Solo's advice, Chambers wrote a lengthy manuscript detailing the life and career of A.A. Rubens and suggested how Rubens and Points' underground work was connected and led to their liquidation. The manuscript, titled The Faking of Americans, reflected the same gendered language Chambers would later use in his book Witness to describe the women caught in the Soviets' clutches. Chambers referred to Ruth Rubens as an American girl or the frightened girl who had fallen prey to her husband's machinations. Solo was equally guilty. He referred to Ruth Rubens as a girl, an American girl, and once a Philadelphia and Long Island girl. Ruth Rubens was certainly not a girl, and by the time of her arrest in Moscow, she was 29 years old and the mother of a 7-year-old daughter and on her second marriage. Okay. Chambers claimed that both A.A. Rubens and Points were targeted for liquidation because they were both linked to General Putna, a disgraced and disavowed Red Army general. He believed that both Rubens and Points were associated with Putna, and when he was executed, his associates became targets. Putna was a Soviet military attaché in London, and both Points and Rubens were known to have traveled there. In August 1936, Putna was accused of plotting against Stalin and put on trial. At one time, Putna participated in the Trotskyite opposition against Stalin. Points herself narrowly escaped expulsion in 1924 when she sided with Ludwig Lohr, a Trotsky ally, against Stalin. She quickly recanted and stayed in the party. Lohr was expelled. Putna's link to Rubens was equally as tenuous. Putna was a Latvian, like Rubens, and Chambers argued that Stalin wanted to loosen the grip the Lets had in the Soviet secret police. Targeting a major Let figure and his allies was a natural means to discredit the Lets and take control of the Secret Service. Historian Robert Thurston has argued that Putna may have in fact been involved in an anti-Stalin plot, and this plot has been cited as the motivation for the show trials. Putna was tried, found guilty, and executed the same day as his sentence in June 1937, only a week after Points went missing. This is a big picture here, but it's very dark. Chambers suggested another link between Points and Rubin, one that Solo and Carlo Tresca had hypothesized in their investigations of their disappearances, that there was a link between the Soviet and German military intelligence, and that Points was that link. An informant by the name of Thoreau gave Solo a picture, this picture, that allegedly depicted Points and Phillips along with notorious Soviet agent George Minks, which Vernon confirms is right there. That's supposed to be Points. And a German agent named Gribel. Solo confirmed that Mark Grabard, that Phillips was pictured. Phillips was a Soviet general, and others identified Mink, but there was some doubt about whether Points was the woman pictured because the woman in the picture was younger than Points. Neither Grabard nor Points' old friend Ludwig Lohr could identify her. In December 1938, Gunther Rumrich, a Nazi spy, helped American intelligence uncover a Nazi spy ring in the U.S. Chambers and Solo believed that the Nazi spy ring was manufactured to draw attention away from the Robinson Rubens and Points. Chambers and Solo both believed that if American intelligence agencies did too much investigation into Points' disappearance, they would uncover a link between the Soviet and German underground. Thus, the Nazi spy ring was a distraction. Both Chambers and Solo believed that the link between the two undergrounds was none other than Points' estranged and now deceased husband, Glaser. By the time of Points' disappearance, Glaser had been dead for 2 years, but he worked in the German consulate in New York. Chambers and Solo believed that Glaser helped Points link the two undergrounds and introduced her to Rubens, who would have gone to the German consulate to secure his false passports. The photograph was proof of the link between the Soviets and the Nazis, and Chambers came to believe that Points' liquidation was the first step in Stalin's terror because she knew too much. This is a remarkable claim because Chambers claims that Points' disappearance was the precipitating event that caused the purges. Thus, he assigned it an enormous amount of influence both in his own defection but in the unraveling of the communist hold on the American left and the emergence of a liberal and neoconservative anti-communism. The very terror that fed American anti-communism, according to Chambers, began with Points. However, there are several problems with the photograph. First, the photograph was not definitive, partly because no one was certain it was Points in the picture, and others felt like it had been doctored. But the source of the photograph, Thoreau, was a problematic character who was once described by a State Department official as a liar, and Solo claimed that he could never be a rebuttal witness because he would likely perjure himself. The largest problem with the theory is that Glaser would have been involved. By all accounts, Points had no contact with Glaser after their split, and neither Points' friends nor Glaser's family and coworkers knew that the two had ever been married. Perhaps most important, while Glaser did work at the German consulate, he was working as a freelance AP reporter, writing on the German steel industry for officials at the consulate. Thus, he was not technically a consulate employee. Glaser's family was part of the I.G. Farber chemical conglomerate, and as his widow, Points was able to claim a portion of his inheritance. She was going through the legal process in the months before his disappearance, and her lawyer claimed she was visibly uncomfortable going to the consulate for fear that Nazi officials would identify her as a Soviet agent. Without tangible evidence, Chambers and Solow could not prove the Nazi-Soviet link. When points went missing, it appeared that Stalin's purges came to America, and that scared many, but none more so than those on the left like Chambers, who feared for his family's life. As Solow and Chambers began to unravel Points' time in the underground, they came to believe that Stalin's terror had claimed an American's life. Points' disappearance and alleged liquidation compelled both Solow and Chambers to make their final break with the Communist Party and Marxism. Both men would become avowed anti-communists in the Cold War. For them, Stalin was not the problem, it was that communism itself was corrosive. Michael Kimmage argues that after the war, the pre-war left and conservatives both turned toward the political center. Some on the left, like Herbert Solow, proved that one could remain liberal and be anti-communist, but anti-communism empowered the right, it gained intellectual respectability and political influence. Meanwhile, on the left, advocating revolution became passé, and moderation dominated liberalism. In many ways, Points' disappearance contributed to the right turn America would make because her disappearance alienated former leftists who would become some of the most vocal anti-communists in the Cold War years. Thank you.
Our final speaker is John Sbardellati from the University of Waterloo in Canada. He and I are the international component of this conference, since we're both Americans living abroad. He is going to speak on a subject that I have always found fascinating, the depiction of communism and radicalism in the movies.
Thank you, Vernon. My paper is entitled Ayn Rand and J. Edgar Hoover Go to the Movies, Contested Visions of Anti-Communism in Hollywood's Early Cold War Films. These are quotes. Don't smear wealth. Don't smear the profit motive. Don't smear the free enterprise system. Don't glorify the collective. Don't deify the common man. Don't smear an independent man. These were but a few of the injunctions put forward in Ayn Rand's Screen Guide for Americans, a pamphlet published in 1947 by an anti-communist film industry group known as the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. Proffered to Hollywood producers as a handbook for the detection of communist propaganda techniques, Rand's manual made little traction with studio moguls, whom she chastised for, quote, unthinking carelessness, and she actually used those words in the pamphlet, in the face of the Red Menace. The Screen Guide found a more receptive audience in J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation. Rand and Hoover soon joined forces to combat the perceived threat of communist infiltration of the Hollywood film industry. In the late 1940s, Hoover's FBI utilized Rand's pamphlet to determine the subversive content of many Hollywood films. But despite this partnership, Rand and Hoover soon parted ways. Indeed, anti-communism was not monolithic. Rand's anti-communism sprang from her conviction that American individualism was in peril, and her urgent desire to defend businessmen and industrialists from the creeping collectivism of the New Deal order. Hoover's anti-communism matched Rand's ferocity, but his brand of counter-subversion differed from that of the quirky pseudo-philosopher. Unlike the atheistic Rand, for whom the Cold War was a struggle between the forces of individualism and collectivism, Hoover conjured up a spiritual battle between God-fearing patriots and godless communists. Collectivism was certainly a dirty word for Hoover as well, but he nevertheless rooted his definition of Americanism in collective social institutions, such as the church, school, family, state, and especially the FBI, all of which he deemed threatened by communist infiltration, not the FBI. Americans would defeat the Reds not as heroic individuals per se, but as citizens united in a common cause, working actively to resist communism through revitalized traditional institutions. Hoover's message was also Hollywood's message. This is not to suggest that Hollywood's anti-communist fare directly interpreted Hoover's ideology, nor should it be said that films merely echoed the powerful pronouncements of the director. Hollywood surely looked to Hoover as a leading expert on anti-communism, but Hoover, in his depiction of the communist foe, likewise drew upon melodramatic narratives of intrigue and subversion long popularized by Hollywood spy and gangster films. Hoover and Hollywood put forward mutually reinforcing images of the Red Menace. Thus, when it came to how Hollywood presented the struggle against communism to American audiences in the early years of the Cold War, Hooverism and not Randism served as the guiding force. Born in Russia, Ayn Rand had escaped the Soviet Union and made her way to Hollywood in 1926. An ambitious writer, it was nevertheless more than a decade before Ayn Rand earned a film credit, and not until 1949 that an original story of hers reached the screen. Rand's strident anti-communism, so out of fashion in the literary world of the 1930s, her abhorrence of collectivism, and her insistence on classifying the New Deal as such, placed her on the right-wing fringe, both politically and artistically. Rand floundered in Hollywood and blamed her failures on her outspoken anti-communist views. She left Tinseltown for New York, abandoned screenwriting for novel writing, and set to work on the anti-collectivist manifesto that would take her many years to write, The Fountainhead. Ayn Rand's purpose in writing The Fountainhead was avowedly propagandistic. She fretted that communists had cultivated many of the leading literary celebrities, such as Orson Welles, Clifford Odets, and John Steinbeck. And with The Fountainhead, she sought essentially to emulate the enemy. As she said, quote, "It's time we realized, as the Reds do, that spreading our ideas in the form of fiction is a great weapon because it arouses the public to an emotional as well as intellectual response to our cause," end quote. Rand envisioned The Fountainhead as a weapon against Roosevelt's policies, confiding to a friend that, quote, "When you read it, you'll see what an indictment of the New Deal it is, although I never mention the New Deal by name." And then she added, quote, "I can be a real asset to our reactionaries." She's straightforward. Actually, she did. She did put that in quotes. When the Fountainhead quickly became a bestseller in 1943, Warner Brothers purchased the screen rights and hired Rand to adapt her own screenplay. The project, however, was delayed for years, and when finally released in 1949, it was a critical flop and a commercial disappointment. But the film nevertheless marked a significant achievement in terms of Rand's ability to bring her vision to the screen nearly unadulterated. And Rand was elated about that, as she said, quote, "For the first time in Hollywood history, the script was shot verbatim, word for word as written. I had no legal control over the production, yet the picture was made as faithfully as if I controlled it," end quote. Though the finished project would truly reflect her ideas, it would not fulfill her vision for its influence. So the film, The Fountainhead, directed by King Vidor, features several characters emblematic of the ideological tenets of Rand's Screen Guide for Americans. The main character, Howard Rourke, who's played by fellow Hollywood anti-communist Gary Cooper, represents Rand's idolization of the quote-unquote independent man. Howard Rourke is an architect by trade and individualist by nature. His integrity is tied to his modernist designs, and he associates the popular penchant for classicism with vulgarity and mediocrity. But Rourke is more than just a man of ideas. He's also the model of masculinity. He's obsessed with building skyscrapers, and visually the film often juxtaposes him against these towering phallic symbols. Rourke catches the eye of Dominique Francone by wielding a powerful drill, literally. Rourke's antagonist in the film is Ellsworth M. Toohey, the evil embodiment of collectivism. He speaks with a British accent, moves around with mincing steps, and sports an effete cigarette holder. Toohey is the manifestation of Rand's image of the communist. He disdains wealth, success, and independence. His only motive is power, easier to amass if a great man like Rourke can be replaced by the mediocre, quote, totally selfless man. This brings us to Howard Rourke's foil, Peter Keating, mediocrity incarnate. In her screen guide, Rand identified glorification of the common man with communist propaganda. She asserted that communists aim to wipe out the independent American spirit and exalt the commoner as part of their method of seizing control. Quote, this is from the screen guide, communism preaches the reign of mediocrity, the destruction of all individuality and all personal distinction, the turning of men into masses, which means an undivided, undifferentiated, impersonal, average, common herd. End quote. With the Peter Keating character, Rand offered audiences a character that she hoped would replace the heroic Tom Joad archetype of the common man, with the image of the common man as parasite. Rand had hoped that her ideological allegory would serve her political cause by stirring emotion, yet the film's mediocre box office performance, combined with its brutal critical reception, suggests that the Fountainhead did not live up to her dreams. It seems that Americans, even in the midst of the Cold War, did not share her philosophy. One scholar has even suggested that Rand's film was, quote, distinctly un-American. Her attack on collectivism impugned not just communism, but many tenets of American democracy as well. Individualism had deep roots in American society, but Americanism nevertheless found expression in collective institutions such as the church, the family, and the state. Furthermore, as Rand biographer Jennifer Burns has demonstrated, Rand's atheism rendered tenuous her position as a leading proponent of anti-communism at a time when conservatives endeavored to link capitalism and Christianity and to define the Cold War struggle as a battle of these forces against godless communism. In February 1946, the same month that Winston Churchill proclaimed the existence of an Iron Curtain dividing Europe, and George Kennan sent his famous long telegram calling for containment of the Soviet Union, the FBI secretly embarked on a massive propaganda campaign designed to cultivate an anti-communist consensus. The campaign included secret leaks to anti-communist journalists and politicians, as well as cooperation with blacklisting organizations and conservative veterans groups. The public side of this propaganda campaign witnessed the rise of J. Edgar Hoover as the nation's most prominent spokesman for the domestic Cold War. Hoover, or rather his ghostwriters in the FBI's Crime Records Division, authored numerous articles, reports, and pamphlets. Such works appeared in publications as diverse as Popular Mechanics and the Harvard Business Review. Hoover also spread his message through many public speeches and interviews, and in his 1958 bestseller, Masters of Deceit. In these many public forums, Hoover not only played the role of the nation's top cop, but also one of its leading sermonizers. Hoover and Hollywood put forward remarkably similar depictions of communism to their early Cold War American audiences. Hoover's speeches and writings and Hollywood's anti-communist films all characterize the party as a criminal underground. Communist leaders come off as little more than ruthless gangsters who use prostitutes to entice members and goon squads to enforce the party line. Most importantly, these ubiquitous anti-communist narratives emphasize the communist threat to traditional American institutions, not only those in the public sphere, such as schools or government, but also the private refuges of the church and family. In this regard, Hoover's writings, like the typical anti-communist Hollywood movie, contrasted with Ayn Rand's definition of the threat. To Rand, collectivism threatened to displace the authority of the supreme individual with rule by the common horde. But to Hoover and Hollywood, communism threatened the very social fabric that united Americans and rendered their country exceptional. Membership in the Communist Party, however, was relatively small in number, and with the onset of the Cold War, diminishing rapidly. Hoover consistently worried that because of the party's small size, the public would underestimate the danger that he believed it represented. Thus, one of his frequent discursive strategies utilized metaphors of infection and disease, since even microscopic germs can threaten contagion. To the FBI director, communism was, quote, a malignant growth which is nurtured in darkness, end quote. And here the Hollywood analog is to be found in the science fiction films of the 1950s, such as Them and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In the former, giant mutant ants have to be quarantined, whereas in the latter, alien pods infiltrate human hosts like a quickly spreading virus. And in that film, the townspeople worry, quote, they're taking us over cell by cell. It's a malignant disease spreading through the whole country, end quote. Given the anti-communist discourse of infection and the tendency to describe communists as brainwashed automatons, it's not surprising that many cultural critics have put forward Cold War readings of these science fiction films. And notably, by the way, in these films, only the FBI can protect Americans from the contamination. But in these other Cold War narratives, the American education system figured as a prime target of communist infiltration. Teachers and intellectuals were potentially subversive agents. So in a speech at Boston University, Hoover warned, quote, you, the college student, are the fertile ground which the communist conspirator hopes to till. Your mind is the soil in which he hopes to implant alien seed, end quote. Anti-communist films such as My Son John from 1952 or I Was a Communist for the FBI from 1951 likewise echo these concerns about public education. In My Son John, Lucille Jefferson's oldest offspring raises her suspicions. And John also shuns members of the opposite sex, preferring to keep company with his highbrow professors who have presumably contaminated him with subversive ideas. To Hoover and Hollywood, communism threatened not only the young, but the entire American family. This message surely struck a chord in the early Cold War era, a time when the ideology of domesticity was linked to national security. Good Americans were expected to abide by traditional gender roles, to form close-knit nuclear families, to rear patriotic children. And so to the purveyors of this domestic ideology, American society came under threat when men and women failed to perform their proper roles. Homophobia and sexism abounded. Defined as sex deviants, homosexuals were considered so threatening that they were purged from the State Department and other government offices. And meanwhile, traditionalists depicted independent or powerful women as equally menacing. Hoover's parables and Hollywood's anti-communist films played upon all of these gender fears. In the movies, communism and homosexuality combined to produce both the evil villain, such as the Toohey character in the Fountainhead, and the easily duped victim, like the character in My Son John. And meanwhile, communist women came in two forms, the alluring temptress or the neurotic, defeminized power seeker. The Greta Block character in The Red Menace conformed to the latter stereotype. She is presented in the film as just another of the, quote, psychopathic misfits who are seeking an outlet for their frustrations and failures in the communist movement. By the way, that characterization in The Red Menace anticipated J. Edgar Hoover's description of a communist woman as one who was motivated by, quote, fanatical dedication and humorless, single-minded intensity to her quest to spread the soulless, vicious, totalitarian, ends justifies the means doctrine of communism, end quote. If Hoover's political sermons and Hollywood's melodramatic propaganda played up the threat of communism to American institutions, they likewise presented the church, school, family, and especially the national security state as the most powerful bastions defending against red encroachment. Hoover always coupled his dire warnings with a revivalist message. Communists targeted America's social institutions, but eternal vigilance could thwart this danger. Perhaps most importantly, Hoover fulfilled the role of prominent spokesperson for what historian Elaine Tyler May later described as the ideology of domestic containment. The traditional home, headed by a male breadwinner and supported by his wife, the dutiful homemaker and selfless nurturer, bolstered the international policy of containment with an equally powerful domestic variant. Hoover defined the housewife as the linchpin of the successful home. Quote, because I feel there are no careers so important as those of homemaker and mother, end quote. Her duty entailed instilling in her children the moral virtue required to wage the Cold War. And Hoover tasked women with maintaining, quote, the security that a good Christian home affords, end quote. So to Hoover, quote, the real danger in communism lies in the fact that it is atheistic, end quote. And therefore, the American mother could play her part in this apocalyptic struggle by raising an upright Christian family. Indeed, Hoover would join those, such as Billy Graham and Cardinal Spellman, in defining the Cold War as a spiritual battle between Christianity and atheistic communism. Grand's claim that communism had been, quote, masterminded by Satan was echoed by the FBI director when he asserted that the Reds', quote, rejection of God gives communism a demonic aspect, transforming it into a fanatical, satanic, brutal phenomenon, end quote. As Bureau scholar Richard Good Powers writes, the nation, quote, the nation's #1 G-man had dropped his machine gun and picked up the cross. Well, Hollywood also picked up the cross in the 1950s. Biblical sagas dominated the box office throughout the decade. Cecil B. DeMille's presented the Ten Commandments, for example, the most popular of these epics, as a Cold War allegory. And likewise, Elia Kazan's On the Waterfront is often read as an anti-communist parable, and notably it features Father Barry, played by Carl Malden, and it's only that character that can help the Brando character overcome his childlike understanding of informing as something that only a stool pigeon would do. But instead, the priest insists that Jesus would not stand by in silence while evildoers run amok. So naming names thus becomes a Christ-ordained sacrament. How influential were these Red Scare films? One can detect the FBI's high hopes and dashed expectations for these movies throughout the Bureau's files. A lot of these films had been produced on the cheap, especially in the wake of the 1947 HUAC trials. And while none of them were huge box office hits, they're very ubiquity, I would say, registered with audiences. So I would say that Hollywood's anti-communist radar surely did not fly. Hollywood's anti-communist propaganda surely did not fly under the radar. But, and just in my closing points here, as cultural artifacts, films could never be entirely malleable to the demands of political indoctrination. And let me close by highlighting just one example of this slippery cultural terrain. And the film I'm choosing is Samuel Fuller's Pickup on South Street from 1953. This gritty film noir, like most of the Red Scare movies, presented the communists as gangster-like thugs whose schemes involved espionage and murder. And yet there the similarities end. FBI agents and local cops appear in the film as little more than hapless obstacles to the protagonist, a pickpocket named Skip McCoy, played by Richard Widmark, who accidentally lifts microfilm from some communist spies as they're trying to smuggle it out of the country. But Skip feels no compulsion to turn these stolen secrets over to the authorities. With national security on the line, Skip cares only about making his big score. The Cold War means nothing to Skip McCoy. In the end, Skip does beat his red nemesis to a bloody pulp, but not for any patriotic reasons. Instead, he's merely seeking revenge for the murder of his friend and the savage beating of his love interest, Candy. Hooverism then has no place in Pickup on South Street. Skip lives outside the reach of traditional American institutions. There's no Irish priest to steer him back to the moral center. If anyone redeems him, it is Candy, a thinly disguised prostitute who spoils his attempt to sell back the microfilm to the communists because, quote, I'd rather have a live pickpocket than a dead traitor. But patriotism means little to Skip McCoy. The FBI in the film tries to pressure him into helping them recover the stolen secrets and to nab the communist spies, threatening that if he doesn't cooperate, he'll be, quote, as guilty as the traitors that gave Stalin the A-bomb. And Skip replies nonchalantly, quote, are you waving the flag at me? According to Samuel Fuller, J. Edgar Hoover, incensed by the pickpocket's political apathy, personally tried to pressure the studio to cut that scene. Fuller alleged that Hoover met with him and with the film's producer, Daryl Zanuck, and insisted, quote, I don't want an American in this Cold War to say to anyone, especially to the cops, don't wave the flag at me. But to these filmmakers, political pressure could only demand so much. Even in a nominally anti-communist film, the protagonist, as a pickpocket, had to be true to his character. And Zanuck apparently closed that meeting by turning to Hoover and saying, quote, Mr. Hoover, you don't know movies. Thank you.
Well, there was 3 very excellent papers. Questions, comments?
Regarding the Rosenbergs, I think it's interesting that both the Communist Party and the Catholic Church opposed their execution. There's probably not a lot of overlap in their perspectives at that time. I wonder if it could have been for similar reasons, if indeed it is true that the Communist Party opposed their execution because it appeared that they're anti-Semitic. I mean, certainly the Catholic Church through World War II faced accusations of anti-Semitism. Did that motivate their opposition as well? Just speculating.
That's a really interesting. The Pope doesn't come out and say, our bad, we were anti-Semitic, obviously. Really pitches it more as, anti-death penalty. But that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
I also have a question for Dr. Clune. To what extent do you think that perhaps the inclination to speak up or not speak up about support for the Rosenbergs extends from kind of like what the first panel was talking about, how some members just simply stopped going to meetings or they would slowly diffuse out of the movement? Do you think that they were consciously trying to think about, like, if I speak up, am I labeling myself as a red, or if I speak up, am I speaking for the communist movement, or am I being an independent person? Do you think that they thought about that at all?
I think so. Like you're saying, like the rank and file folks. Yeah, I think they would have to, right? Because it's such a charged time that, and I think when embassy officials assume that anyone who's supporting the Rosenbergs, I guess except for the Pope, is a communist, then it's hard to venture into that without knowing you're going to be labeled as that. So are you, a leftist anti-communist who's entering this? Are you a former communist who's entering? Are you an active communist? I think they're all kind of navigating those different paths, and I find it fascinating that they come to this common ground, but I think they come from very different places.
But it's interesting, it's not just the Catholic Church and the Communist Party that opposes the execution. J. Edgar Hoover wrote a letter to the judge opposing the execution of Ethel because she was a mother of 2 small children.
And we listened. I know, when J. Edgar Hoover's saying it, you're like, maybe someone should listen, yeah.
Go ahead.
Regarding the films, anti-communist film, you mentioned the language of contagion. A lot of these films are sort of from the early 50s.
Yeah.
There's great fear of polio at that time too, and like this, menace. I wonder if there's any parallel there, if they were using some of that language.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that connection myself when I was looking for it. Off the top of my head, I don't recall any sort of explicit comparisons to communism and polio per se. But there's a lot of the disease discourse is particularly striking, and Hoover is by no means the only one doing this in the public sphere. But it's interesting that there's a match there between Hoover
And Rand's film, you mentioned using this sort of phallic imagery.
It's pretty explicit, by the way.
It sounds pretty.
I just know that's not new. If you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, William the Conqueror's horse is much more well endowed than his opponents. So.
Just a personal vignette regarding the Rosenbergs and the different motivations that might have gone into working on their behalf. I don't want to date myself, but as a child, I remember we had a ping pong table in our basement, and there were many, many letters and envelopes on that ping pong table that my father told my brother and me we needed to stuff the envelope with these letters. I have no idea who they were going to in terms of the support for the Rosenbergs. Now, as far as I was concerned, my motivation for supporting them was being able to play ping pong with them.
Completely understandable.
Yes, in the back.
I would like you to comment on the power of Rand's book and the sort of lack of power of all of those movies. Is the book more powerful than the film, or have I got that wrong?
Well, and the book has had a certain staying power that the film hasn't had, and a lot of people still like the book a lot and don't necessarily recognize its political context. I also, and I didn't work this into the paper, but I do sort of think that in the current contemporary context, Randism might be making a comeback, and Hooverism might be flagging among American conservatives. This sort of glorification of the individual and of selfishness and all this kind of thing, which I mean, Rand specifically said we should glorify selfishness. That seems to me to be maybe making a comeback in this particular era. So I think you're right that her book had a certain staying power that the film didn't quite translate.
There's one more point, that Hoover's behavior was accepted, but I'm thinking today, should somebody like that behave like that? Would we didn't react, people my age didn't react the way I imagine academia and the left would react to somebody like that today. Am I wrong about that?
Sorry, which behavior?
I said Hoover.
Oh, Hoover's behavior.
Yeah, Hoover's behavior, which was outright political, outright Republican, outright almost beyond the pale for an official.
Yeah. The one thing I might take issue with there would be the outright Republican. Hoover was a very skilled bureaucrat, and he was quite good at sort of tying himself to both parties. Really, and the expansion of his power comes about during Roosevelt's era. I think that's part of it, but he also really cultivated a apolitical image of the FBI in terms of partisanship. And wanted to, that was the public image that he cultivated, and in the context of the 40s and 50s, he was seen as the leader of the responsible anti-communism, and often juxtaposed against sort of McCarthy or HUAC, even though behind the scenes, he was secretly helping them. So it's rather quite complex, but I would say at the end of the day, it touches on his acumen as a bureaucrat.
I just want to share something about myself and Hoover. I had occasion to consult with the FBI on a technical matter, and I was at FBI headquarters in New York City. Yeah, it was in New York City. And they took me to his office. He wasn't in the office, but they took me in there. And do you know, the office was a very big room, and he was a short guy, and his desk was on a platform.
I've heard that. I've heard that part of that was his germ fears, and he wanted to be elevated from the floor.
I have a question for two of the panelists. Okay, so Laurie, I'll start with you. I wondered if, you're thinking about these dates of when, how it was that the Communist Party or the Communist leadership in Moscow, whatever it was, got involved. And I'm wondering also about the death of Stalin, because he died in March of '53 and they were executed in June. So I didn't know if even some later dates might be more revealing or bring in some interesting other aspects. I don't know.
It's interesting, right, because it's such a pivotal moment, but it seems like so much protest has kicked up before that, that I don't see, I see a huge increase in June, once the date is pretty solid, right? But I don't see something. I'll go back and check though, because you'd think there'd be something that would trigger something. Yeah.
Yeah. Going on, Eisenhower coming into office, all these different things happening in that
busy
early part of '53. And then for Denise, I wondered. We still don't know, right, what happened to Juliet Stewart Points. It's still an open question. Nothing is ever, even though many of us, I guess, have been to archives and researched some of these things. That it's just don't know, right? We know way more about older hits than we know about what happened to her. And I wondered if, do you think we'll ever find out, or do we ever get?
I don't know. When I was doing research on this, I came across somebody, the book The Lost Spy. The author actually got a testimony from a family member to get information from the KGB archives to say, like, this is what happened to your family member. So I was like, oh, this is all I have to do for points. And then Putin came into power, and I was like, okay, well, I guess transparency's gone. But I did find an effort by somebody, I just found his paperwork in archive of someone else's collection, who had tried that and found Juliet Stewart Points never had children, but her sister did. So they found one of Points' nephews and got got him to sign something to say we would really like this information. I don't know if it was ever pursued, so I don't know. Maybe if there's ever a post-Putin era, we can figure out a way. I did try to find a living relative too, and I just kind of gave up after a while. I was like, this is not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I was going to say that in response to that, in the Vasilyev notebooks, there is one suggestion, that's all it is, that it was Sherbiansky's special tasks unit that disappeared her. And the problem is that I think that was connected to GRU, which, the GRU archives are sealed. Nobody has had any access to them. And my guess is there's no prospect of them having any access to them.
Right.
I think it's widely assumed that either she was smuggled on a Soviet ship or she was killed and buried somewhere.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I really enjoyed the connection with Chambers House. Really.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
The other interesting thing, as I'm sure you know, is that she was connected to Elizabeth Bentley. And
Yes.
she helped recruit that.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, the Bentley Boyd story. Yeah.
Any other comments? If not, then I want to thank our panelists for an excellent presentation.